Right now, leaders from some of the most powerful countries in the world are right next door in Alberta. Prime Minister Mark Carney hosting the leaders of the UK, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the always unpredictable United States President Donald Trump, who did leave early. Mark Carney has also invited other world leaders, including Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky and the controversial Indian President Narendra Modi. And of course, it's against a backdrop of an escalating Middle Eastern crisis. Today on Blue Sky, we're talking about the role Canada should be playing on the world stage in an age of foreign election interference, disinformation, shattered security alliances, and Donald Trump. What can world leaders actually agree on, and what do their priorities mean for everyday Canadians? If you have thoughts, we want to hear from you today. Call 1-800-716-2221 or email bluesky@cbc.ca. I have two guests standing by to take your calls. One has been studying the impact of the G7 summits. She'll dig into whether the promises actually translate into concrete outcomes or if it's just political spectacle. And we'll speak to a U of R professor of international studies who says this is an incredibly important political moment for Canada. But let's start things off by hearing from the Prime Minister. Mark Carney says this summit in Kananaskis marks a turning point in history, where the world is turning to the G7 for leadership. Here is Prime Minister Carney giving his opening remarks yesterday.
Good morning, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Welcome to Kananaskis and the 2025 G7 Leaders Summit. I'm pleased all leaders are here, honored by your presence. In my home province, Alberta, in the heart of the Canadian Rockies, I'd note that we are also meeting on Treaty 7 territory. These are the traditional lands of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Stoney Nakoda Nations, and the Tsuut'ina First Nations. And we're gathering at one of those turning points in history. I think we all recognize that turning point where the world looks to this table for leadership. 50 years ago in France, a group of leading industrial nations got together in the face of global economic and financial crisis. The end of the international monetary system is known. Stagflation threatening. Challenges in the Middle East, geopolitical challenges in the Middle East, and it was the frank, informal discussions around that table in Rambouillet that led to a long period of decisions and prosperity at that time. Alors, nous avons la chance d'avoir le doyen du G7 avec Monsieur le Président maintenant. And then following the fall of the Berlin Wall, the G7 gathered to integrate those countries that had been behind the Iron Curtain of communism and to accelerate the flow of capital and trade to the developing world. 23 years ago, the G7 met here in Kananaskis. We were just talking about it. And that was when the world was still reeling from the aftershocks of 9/11, another turning point in history. And amongst the many decisions taken were control of the spread of weapons of mass destruction, a subject that we'll be coming back to. So as I said, we're meeting at one of those hinge moments, those turning points in history. The world's more divided and dangerous. Hostile states and terrorists have expanded their capabilities and their reach, threatening global security in our local communities. Global commerce, energy systems, even intelligence are all being rewired. En tant que membre du G7, nous avons la possibilité de façonner le monde de demain. Le monde plus sûr, plus prospère, plus juste et plus libre. Mais le G7 doit s'adapter pour arriver à ses fins. Nostalgia isn't a strategy. We have to change with the times and to build a better world. And some of you, such as you, Mr. President, have anticipated these massive changes and are taking bold measures to address them. All of us around this table are reinforcing our militaries and security services for the new world. But we all know that there can be no security without economic prosperity, and no prosperity without resilience. And in a world where shocks flow across the borders, that resilience comes from cooperation around that starts around this table, cooperation that can lead to a new era of prosperity. energy security and critical minerals, artificial intelligence, quantum, combating human smuggling, and transnational repression. So we will have open, frank discussions over the course of the next 2 days. We might not agree on absolutely every issue, but where we will cooperate, we will make an enormous difference for our citizens and for the world, and bring the next era of prosperity, I hope, to the benefit of those we serve.
That was Prime Minister Mark Carney speaking at the opening of the G7 summit. Say that 5 times fast. In Kananaskis, Alberta yesterday. I have 2 bright minds standing by to take your calls today and to have this great conversation about Canada's place in the world. Ella Kokotsis is the Director of Accountability for the G7 Research Group at the University of Toronto. She recently wrote an article for Maclean's that grabbed my attention. It said, yes, the G7 matters to Canadians. Here's why. She argues that in a Trump era, this annual summit is more relevant than ever. Ella, welcome to Blue Sky.
Oh, thanks, Sam, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
And in our Regina studio with me is Brian McQuinn. He's an associate professor of international studies at the University of Regina. He's also co-director of the Center for Artificial Intelligence, Data and Conflict, and host of a new podcast called Rebuilding Canada's Influence. Brian, welcome back to Blue Sky.
I was inspired by you.
No, you were not. You had this in the works, but thank you for the flattery nonetheless. You both just heard what the Prime Minister had to say in his opening remarks. For me, it was that nostalgia is not a strategy. That's the line that stood out for me. Ella, I'll start with you. What did you take away from his opening remarks?
Yeah, I also love that line, right? I mean, we're now looking at 50 years of G7 as it marks that, critical milestone this year in Kananaskis. And, as the Prime Minister outlined, he gave a very, clear high-level synopsis of some of the major milestones that the G7 has produced over the years since its inception in 75. Of course, Canada joined in 76. And we've seen the ups and downs. There have been times in between those 50 years where the world has paid very little attention to the G7, despite meeting annually and despite leaders attending every year. I think it's important for the audience to know that the G7 has actually had a perfect attendance record over the last 50 years. So leaders may, leave a little early like Trump did yesterday, but they've still, come every year. And I think that gives, really important, it highlights really importantly that the G7, matters to these leaders, that, it is a relevant institution and it has weathered these up and down cycles economically and also geostrategically over the past half century.
Ella, for people who are listening, because you have researched this so extensively, I would love if you could give a layperson description of what the G7 is. Because I think for years, I remember the big one in Toronto where there was policing and it was a whole big thing. But you might see G7 in the news headlines and see, oh, that's a bunch of politicians, and not really pay attention to why it's so important. So can you give a basic description of what the G7 is?
Sure. And I mean, you're right, Sam. I've heard it labeled even a global hot tub party. Do the leaders come together? I know, can you imagine that imagery? Leaders come together, and is it really just a big party, or does, anything of significance or value actually get accomplished? And I think what the most important outcome of these particular sets of meetings is every year is that leaders from the 7 most advanced economies, democratically advanced economies, okay? And that's important because that's what underlies, this particular grouping, because of course we have the G20, but that includes a number of, non-democratic countries. But the G7 itself comes together once a year. These leaders meet face to face. And I think that's where the real value is in these meetings. They have those formal sessions where the leaders meet as a group of 7 and they talk about issues ranging from the global economy to, international trade negotiations, to global security issues, to energy security issues, AI adoption. I mean, there's a wide spectrum of issues. But what happens on the margins of those formal meetings, I think, is what's really interesting. Leaders will meet and have bilaterals. That means two countries will sit down to talk about issues that are important to both of them. They could have trilateral meetings. We were hoping that there was going to be, for example, a meeting between Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. president, but of course, Trump left early. That would give them an opportunity to talk about potentially renegotiating the Canada-U.S.-Mexico free trade agreement. So a lot of times the meetings that happen formally are the ones that we see photo ops. People question, do these really turn into anything significant? But I'd say, Sam, the real value in these meetings is what happens, outside of those sessions, when the leaders are talking to each other over dinner, or they're at a cultural event, or they're walking from one venue to another. We don't necessarily get to hear what happens in those moments, but that's when the leaders have an opportunity to really breach some sensitive issues between countries. And that eventually leads to potential, diplomatic outcomes on issues that have been sticky between these countries. So it's a really important and intimate opportunity for them to connect face to face. And I think at the end of the day, that's where the value of the G7 is, not necessarily on, the thousands of words that are, in these outcome documents, but the ability to meet in an intimate setting, face to face.
There is a lot of smiling and nodding in photo ops. Do they ever get feisty and disagree?
They absolutely do. I mean, we saw this firsthand in Charlevoix when Canada last hosted a summit back in 2018. And although, the leaders stood together and they took their traditional family photo and everybody looked happy, of course, we know Trump left in a bit of a huff. He got on Air Force One. He was not happy with Prime Minister Trudeau after Trudeau signaled that he might take retaliatory measures against U.S. Steel and aluminum tariffs. And, Trump was a little annoyed at that. And he started tweeting from Air Force One that the prime minister, was weak. And that began, a bit of a diplomatic spat between the two of them, which, of course, we know lasted for years, right, Sam? So things
is it over even, really?
It's not. Is it over, really?
I wouldn't even say it's over, really.
No, he was taking jabs at Trudeau, even, in Kananaskis. He hasn't stopped. I mean, this is, he gets a thorn in his side, and then he's not so quick to let go of grudges, that's for sure. Let's just put it that way.
Brian, I want to hear what your takeaways from the Prime Minister are, but I also don't want to forget that I want to ask you about the extra invites to the party, the extra people that were invited along. But first off, what did you take away from the opening remarks?
I think it's always important to sort of take a step back and say, well, why are we doing this? Why does Canada invest the huge amount of energy and time? Because obviously the Prime Minister is not focused on issues, within Canada while he's there. And I think it's always important to remember is how do countries influence the world? And the idea that he is sitting at a table with Trump to his side, who's quiet, and listening to him, and he's setting the stage for basically most of the more powerful countries in the world, except for China and India, that are sitting there, really demonstrates Canada sort of at the table, setting the table. And we go back to something that Carney said, if we are not at the table, negotiating the table, we are on the menu. And I think making Canada really show its sort of stature in the world means that we're demonstrating that we're a little more powerful than maybe people like Trump and others might think. And I think that's important for really creating a profile that allows us to have more negotiating strength and be taken a little more seriously when we engage on these sort of things.
Why is he being taken more serious than Justin Trudeau? Why not the same? Why didn't he get on? Is it Mark Carney's background? I'm so curious because we see the pot shots that were taken at Justin Trudeau over the years. We haven't seen the same taken at Mark Carney, and it could have started during the election campaign, and it didn't. We saw him attack Pierre Poilievre actually during the election campaign.
Counterintuitively.
Right.
So I think it's important to realize that in some ways Carney's kind of lived his sort of trained his whole life to be in these moments. He's like those basketball players who, give me the ball in the last 2 minutes or in the last couple of seconds. He really lives for these kinds of moments. Most politicians kind of don't particularly like this because the possibility of things going very wrong are real. I think in many ways, both from his career perspective, he has been a Sherpa at these before. He has played a role within these kinds of dynamics. And all of the relationships that he has built while he was governor of England and other places, he knows a lot of these people. So this is very much familiar territory for him. And so that stature, that those relationships, as we were just saying, is important, that trust. And so he is just seen much more seriously in that sense.
So he has the respect of the table as soon as he sits down.
And you can see that with Trump. I mean, even Trump the other day was like, he has a different view of tariffs. It's a bit more complicated, but it works in its own way. Like, so he actually, that respect is there. Now, how long that lasts, and, we know that Trump can change his mind. But the other thing, too, that I think it's really important to show with the G7 is it's not just the leaders, is that there is this entire infrastructure that happens underneath with ministerial meetings and then sort of bureaucrats at different levels also meeting. And so it creates this infrastructure of meeting and relationship building that puts us at the center of that. So our relationships are being forged not just at the leader level, which is important, obviously, for that trust, but at the ministerial and then the lower level, because that's where things often get done. That's where, even in the context of the United States, you have your political leadership, but you have all the the diplomats below that who are slightly more sane. And so those relationships and being able to figure out how you maneuver that becomes really, really important as well.
Let's talk about the extra invites, yes. Brian, Ella. We know that Volodymyr Zelensky was invited. We know Narendra Modi was invited. Ella, how often and how prestigious are the guests that get added to the G7 over the years?
Sam, there's always an invite list that gets extended to a number of outreach partners and countries, and that's absolutely not unusual. I know there's been a lot of focus this year, and there have been a lot of questions around, why are we inviting these outside guests? But that is not atypical. That happens every year. It's always a combination of countries that somehow tie into the themes that the host country has put together for that particular summit. And it also includes a number of international organizations. We've got the NATO Secretary General. We've got the Secretary General from the United Nations. We've got, the IMF, leadership there as well from the International Monetary Fund. So it's a combination of countries and heads of key international institutions. And I think this year was no exception to that. I mean, I think our Prime Minister's list of invited guests was strategic insofar as, Australia has been invited, and South Korea and South Africa and India and Brazil. And these are countries to which Canada is looking to pivot as we look at other trading relationships with countries outside of not only our immediate trading relationship with the United States, but also outside of the G7. Right? We're very actively pursuing various relationships as we navigate these interesting times and pivot away from our traditional trading relationship with the U.S. And these countries also, I think represent to a large extent regional security. They reflect regional security concerns, right? So including Australia and including countries like South Korea and countries from the Indo-Pacific is a reflection of, there are, strategic and military interests in those areas. And Canada needs to also understand those and be actively engaged. And there's also tech issues, of course, advanced technologies and how we integrate AI, and bringing India into that conversation, of course, is critical. Understanding there's a lot of sensitivity around why Modi was invited to be here. I could certainly speak to that, but more broadly, Sam, it's not unusual to have these guests invited, and this guest list, I think, reflects Canada's priorities, not just internationally, but also domestically in terms of how we pivot away from the U.S.
I'm not surprised that Zelensky was invited. He, and I say this respectfully, kind of shows up anywhere that he's invited because he wants so badly for his country to not be under attack anymore. Right. So he will go pretty much anywhere that he can secure support or help. But when it comes to Modi, talk about that sensitivity that you referenced there.
Yeah, I mean, Canada is home to one of the largest East Indian diasporas in the world. And we've got almost, I think, 2 million East Indians here, very large Sikh community as well. And there was resistance from the Sikh community. I think that's understandable in allowing Modi to come here, particularly as the RCMP investigation is still ongoing into Nijar's, assassination 2 years ago. But, I think the Prime Minister was very clear in his intent to invite Modi. Yes, there was this diplomatic rift between Trudeau and Modi, and rightfully so. There was a Canadian assassinated, and potentially there was, transnational interference in that assassination. But on the other hand, I don't think we can, negate the importance of a trading relationship too with India, as we look at, critical earth minerals and supply chains and, technology development. I mean, we need to also, be cognizant that India is the 5th largest economy in the world, and it's a strategic importance to Canada to have that relationship with India. And I think, both Mark Carney and our Foreign Affairs Minister, Anita Anand, were very clear in suggesting the invite to Modi is really separate from the RCMP's ongoing investigation. That is still ongoing. This does not in any way negate the RCMP's investigation into the assassination. And, there is potential now, I think, in assuming a rebalancing of this diplomatic relationship with India, that India may also cooperate further in the RCMP's investigation. So I think it's a really good move to have Modi here personally.
I'm Sam McKegg, and you are listening to Blue Sky. Today we are talking about Canada's place in the world as leaders are gathered in Kananaskis for the G7. Keith sends an email, and we would love to hear from you today as well. 1-800-716-2221 or email us bluesky@cbc.ca if you have thoughts on Canada's place in the world, on geopolitics, international politics, or this meeting of leaders happening next door in Alberta. Keith says in an email, all the talking heads blab their opinions about what should be done, but the elephant in the room is the unpredictable and idiotic American president. Pretty hard to plan anything with 4 years of his chaos. That email comes to us from Keith. Brian, I think that is kind of, when he says the elephant in the room, and not to call Donald Trump the problem child, but I will call him the problem child for the purposes of this argument.
He's much more dangerous than just a problem child.
But when you talk about world matters and making long-term plans and diplomatic agreements and international security, when you consider the conflict happening in the Middle East, what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening in Gaza, there's a lot of stuff going on in the world right now. How do you have a serious conversation among politicians when one tweet from one person can literally throw the markets or the whole world into chaos? How do they plan? We've never seen anything like this before.
No, and Keith is 100% right. The question, though, is what do you do with that? You can't you're by no means going to change that behavior and that sort of both irrational but also sort of self-defeating, I think, and self-harming behavior. So he's absolutely right. The question is, how do you create the environment around that? One, to minimize that. And this is one of the reasons why inviting all the people that were invited is you're diffusing that power. Having him sit among sort of 7 people who are all speaking reasonably.
Equals.
Who are all at an equal table, who are all speaking reasonably. You could even see in his body he was much more sort of agreeable. He didn't make the kind of outlandish comments in quite the same way as he normally would, as opposed to when he has someone in the Oval Office and what some people call the dunce chair, where he puts someone down and then just kind of humiliates them. Here, we are controlling the environment. Now, he is not controllable, but you shape the environment. You have the Indian Prime Minister there. You really create a lot of these sort of broader dynamics that we have to plan around that. We have to take that into account. And that's not something we're saying, therefore, it's not going to happen. We just have to make sure that we have that ability to deal with it. And as we were saying before, with having India and South Africa, they're part of BRICS, this other sort of emerging new power of which China and Russia are the core of. We are trying to combat that as Canadians. So what do? We invite the other 3 people in BRICS to this and pull them closer to the G7 in order to sort of try to create competing centers of gravity. The U.S. is no longer going to be the sort of center of gravity that it has been because of the way of the sort of erratic actions. But they're still the most powerful military in the world by orders of magnitude, and they have the largest economy. So we have to start taking that into account, and that's why we're trying to do all the things. And that's in many ways what Carney's trying to do with bringing all these other people to have that conversation.
Let's hear a little bit from Donald Trump. We know he left.
Let's not.
We knew he left last night, but I think he is an important part of this conversation. He left last night saying he had to go deal with the crisis in the Middle East. Before he left, he met with Mark Carney. And responding to reporters' questions, he said he was a, quote, tariff person, as you mentioned, Brian, and added that he and Carney have different concepts around trade, but that they will consider both approaches. Soon after, Trump was asked about Iran and Israel. And then later, Trump falsely claimed that Justin Trudeau had a hand at kicking Russia out of the G8 in 2014. In fact, that happened when Stephen Harper was still in office. Take a listen to some of that press conference.
Thank you very much.
What is holding up a deal with Canada from your perspective?
It's not so much holding up. I think we have different concepts. I have a tariff concept, and Mark has a different concept, which is something that some people like. But we're going to see if we can get to the bottom of it today. I'm a tariff person. I've always been a tariff. It's simple, it's easy, it's precise, and it just goes very quickly. And I think Mark has a more complex idea, but also very good. So we're going to look at both, and we're going to see what we're going to come out with something, hopefully.
Do you think a deal is achievable within days, within weeks? Is there that kind of runway?
Yeah, it's achievable. Both parties have to agree. Yeah, sure.
Mr. President, Israel and Iran, have you heard any signals or seen any messages from intermediaries that Iran wishes to de-escalate the conflict?
Yeah.
What have you heard? What have you heard from the Iranians?
They'd like to talk, but they should have done that before. I had 60 days, and they had 60 days, and on the 61st day, I said, we don't have a deal. They have to make a deal, and it's painful for both parties, but I'd say Iran is not winning this war, and they should talk, and they should talk immediately before it's too late.
And what would you say, in your opinion, what would it take for the U.S. to get involved in this conflict militarily?
I don't want to talk about that.
And you mentioned Putin. Do you think that he should have a seat at the G7 today, that it should be the G8?
I'm not saying he should at this point, because too much water's gone over the dam, maybe. But it was a big mistake. Obama didn't want him, and the head of your country, the proud head of your country, didn't want him. This was a big mistake. You wouldn't have that war. You know, you have your enemy at the table. Even I don't even consider him. He wasn't really an enemy at that time. There was no concept. If I were president, this war would have never happened. But likewise, if he were a member of what was called the G8 at that time, it was always the G8. You wouldn't have a war right now.
Why not? What intelligence support are you providing Israel?
We've always supported Israel. We have for a long period of time, strongly. And Israel's doing very well right now.
Why not have China at the G8? Why not have China here, the biggest economy in the world after the United States?
Well, it's not a bad idea. I don't mind that. If somebody wants to suggest China coming in, I think we suggest. But
Thank you. If you don't mind, I'm going to exercise my role, if you will, as G7 chair, since we have a few more minutes with the president and his team, and then we actually have to start the meeting to address some of these big issues. So, alors, merci beaucoup.
Okay, that was U.S. President Donald Trump and Prime Minister Mark Carney speaking to reporters in Alberta on the sidelines of the G7 summit. Ella, do you think that it is helpful to leaders that Trump made an appearance but maybe did leave early so they can actually get things done?
To a large extent.
I say that tongue in cheek, but I also say that seriously because he is a bit of a distraction.
Yeah, no, he absolutely is. Walking time bomb. You just don't know what he's going to say, when he's going to say it, how he's going to say it. And there was so much fact checking in that statement alone, right? It's not always been a G8 until Russia was pushed out of the grouping. It was always a G7. The G8 became a G8 when Russia was let into the club in the late 90s. And then, they were expelled from the club in 2014 when they annexed Crimea. And that had nothing to do with Trudeau. Obviously, he wasn't, our leader then. But it also had nothing to do with Stephen Harper. It had everything to do with Putin. That was Putin's decision, right? And so the G7 at the time, the other leaders in the grouping, they basically said, no, we can't have that. Like, we can't have a country that's, annexing other nations. I mean, it just doesn't work that way. And so, to say that Russia's always been part of the group is false. To say that Stephen Harper had something to do with it is, categorically wrong. And to have him there, look, I think during the first day, as Brian said, I think there was a lot of merit in having Trump at the table. He's obviously not entirely comfortable in these situations. You can see some, deference to the other leaders. He was being very polite in instances. He was, being, I think, diplomatic and civil in a number of ways. And there was a lot of talk on day one around really important issues to do with the global economy, to do with, peace and security issues where you want to engage the President of the United States. And if we pivot to day two today, on the agenda, we've got discussions with Zelensky and NATO, and then this afternoon discussions with outreach partners. So I think if there was a day for Trump to stay, it definitely was yesterday. So I think it was helpful that he was here yesterday. And in terms of getting stuff done, well, they're not agreeing to a joint communique like they normally do at the G7 anyway. They knew consensus wouldn't be possible. So we're going to see a series of outcome documents. And as Brian mentioned earlier, a lot of that work is done behind the scenes with, the Sherpas, the diplomats, and the ministers anyway. So I think there's still some hope that we're going to see some, cooperation with the Americans even after Trump's left the building.
I want to go to the phones because we do want to hear from our listeners today as well. 1-800-716-2221, or you can send us an email, bluesky@cbc.ca. Chris in Regina is on the line. Chris, go ahead.
Good afternoon. Interesting topic. I'm going to toss a few ideas into the mix and then wait for a response from your guests. Someone made a key point at one stage of this conversation, and the G7 is a group of democracies. And, of course, Putin's actions in Crimea in 2014 were, that resulted in their expulsion. Trump doesn't grasp this because Trump is not really committed to democracy. This is becoming more and more clear every day if you follow domestic developments in the United States. And I think it's inevitable and a good thing that Canada and other sane countries in the world are going to probably draw closer together and form much closer strategic and economic ties in the face of the insanity that's going on south of the border. And you referred to Trump as the elephant in the room. If the United States continues on its current trajectory, I think this may have seemed absolutely improbable at one time, but we may see the United States no longer part of the G7 because they may no longer be a functional democracy. I sincerely hope things do not come to that point, but I'm just watching how things are developing, and I think that is now a possibility. So with that, I'll just leave it to your guests to comment.
Okay. Thanks, Chris. Ella, do you want to go first?
Sure. We're all, watching what's happening south of the border, and it's just so troubling on so many levels. Every day we're unpacking the news and, trying to, decide, is this actually, wither the United States in terms of, is this, a democracy that is crumbling in front of our very eyes? It's front and center in terms of conversations that I'm having with my peers every day. There's so much concern around that, and rightfully so. The signals coming out of Washington are alarming, and they're happening every day. It's almost impossible to keep up with a news cycle, right? On the other hand, I think excluding the United States from the mix is also dangerous, because I think this type of opportunity enables us to bring in the president and at least try to forge consensus around some international commitments that still matter, that are important not only to Canadians, but also, to the world, and engage with the Americans. And I think any opportunity to engage in a multilateral setting like this that includes the U.S. president at this point in the game, I think is a really, really valuable opportunity. And in 2 years from now, the United States is going to be hosting its own G7. So there's a 7-year cycle. It always goes back to the country of origin. So we go back to France next year, the United States the year after. And, Trump's a showman. He's going to want to bring everybody, I think, to the United States to throw this big event together, to show that he's the boss, that he's controlling the agenda, that he's leading on some of these really important international topics. So although I understand the point that we're watching perhaps democracy crumble in front of our very eyes, or at least to a point in the United States, I think there's still merit in continuing to engage with the United States, continuing to invite the United States, and hopefully have the U.S. host in 2 years from now. That would be a win.
Brian, is it dangerous to exclude the United States from a conversation?
Extremely dangerous, partly because our security is based on that and based on the U.S. If we look at NATO, we look at NORAD. NORAD, we sort of co-host that. It's a bi-country institution that we are at the core of. I think it's really important that we always remember that Trump and the sort of dynamics of the White House is not the entirety of the United States. Mm-hmm. Trump would like us to think that, and his truly unique ability to draw attention from the entire planet on a regular basis is really, in some ways, as a showman in that sense, if attention is the goal, he is truly, in his own league. But you have to remember that there are also, the military, there is also all the other branches of the government and all the other sort of political structures within the United States. And it is easy sometimes, I think, to forget that. And also just the ties that we have. Our military is based on integration into there. We are one of the only militaries that our ships can slide into one of their convoys and just sort of continue on. And so we are so deeply integrated, which isn't to say that is inherently a good thing because of what we're finding out now. Mm-hmm. But it means that struggling through that is infinitely required on our part. It would be easy to say we're going to walk away, but we would be very, very unprotected at that point. And so I think the challenge of sticking with it, the challenge of finding ways of putting him in a room with other leaders that he respects and trying to sort of encourage that. And as we were talking about before, Putin understands this. He talks to him more regularly than any other leader in the world. He does that because he wants to influence him and he wants to continue shaping how he thinks about the world. We have to do that as well. We have to make sure that we are the one he's talking to him more often. Despite all of the insanity and more importantly, the dangerous anti-democratic elements that are there. But I think we're going to look back in a couple of years and see over the next 6 months will be the height of his power. I think once the midterms happen and things begin to start really coming home as far as the tariffs and their impact on the average American, I think we're going to see a lot of that shift. Now, the instability that's going to come from what comes next is really worrisome. But I think it's really hard sometimes, especially when Trump's ability to gain all that attention is there, to realize that this is just a moment in history and that these things do ebb and flow in really important ways and that we don't get caught up in his desire to have him be the center of everything and that he defines everything.
Okay, let's stop talking about Donald Trump.
I know, exactly. But he's doing it right now. He's literally able to do that everywhere he goes. And that's part of what he's able to do in the sort of controversy, the way he sort of is always throwing these one-liners out.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I want to talk about Canada's place in the world and what's accomplished at these G7 summits over the years. Ella, where would you say Canada sits right now as a place in the world among these countries and otherwise?
Well, I think, Sam, this is a real hinge moment for Canada. We're seeing Carney really step up to the plate. He put a very ambitious agenda together for this G7 summit that covers, a breadth of economic, geostrategic issues, security issues, technology issues, energy security issues that are important to Canadians, first and foremost, but, issues that impact the G7 and the broader alliance of countries that Carney has invited this year. So I think we're seeing an opportunity here for Canada to really take the lead. All eyes have been on Carney to see how he manages these very complicated international relationships. And I think so far, so good. We're going to have a final press conference from the Prime Minister later this afternoon. We'll be tuning in to hear that. But along the way, he's had a number of very important bilateral meetings with, leaders from Japan and Germany and Italy and also meeting with Zelensky. And I think, as Brian also indicated earlier, this is Canada really stepping up to the plate and saying, we are ready to re-engage. We have to. We don't have a choice at this point. America has shown us that, we can't rely on them any further, at least, for the moment and until Trump leaves office. Hopefully things will revert to where they were, but perhaps not completely as they were. In the meantime, we have to shift our focus and we have to pivot. So I think it's an important moment for Canada to show strength. And if there can be some consensus around some of these important issues coming out of this, it'll be a big win for Canada. And Carney.
Brian, I think of, and I mean, obviously I'm Canadian and have lived here my whole life, but I kind of think of Canada as a little bit of like the kindergarten teacher that's helped the kids along, because we've had other people guiding us up to this point, and we haven't had to, herd cats in the way that, or herd little kids in the way that we are now. I'm wondering, in terms of, I know that your specialty is AI and security, those conversations, we don't think of Canada as a superpower necessarily for those things, but they're the way of the world right now. Where does the security conversations, AI, tech, where does that fall into this so that we are not left behind?
And this is the main challenge. And I think one of the reasons why AI and quantum is on that list is because Canadian leaders are really clear about this. Obviously, the U.S. is dominant in this field. But I think one of the reasons why we've beginning to invest as much as we have, and we have our 3 AI institutes in Canada, and they're slowly actually beginning to steal some people from the U.S. as that begins to become more unstable. But we have to do more. We are really falling behind. We were talking earlier, but like most of the military strategies that we have in Canada never plan for the United States to be anything but a strong ally. Mm-hmm. And so there is, I think even on the AI side of things, we really have always been integrated into what was going on. There is now a push because the fact is we are not going to be included in a lot of what happens there. And so I think when we look at Carney placing Canada in this sort of broader spectrum of relationships, NATO's coming up in a couple of weeks is really showing that Canada, in fact, is able to play that role. Because as the U.S. becomes more sort of destabilized and the reputation is tarnished in many ways, we have that ability to step up. And so I think this is where we really play that role. But at the same time, we are deeply integrated into the U.S. economy and into the security structure. And so we have to be cognizant of that. And this is where I think more and more as Canadians, we are sort of aware of this. And when I walk down the street and I'm sitting in bars chatting with people about things, Canadians really care about this, and they really see Canada wanting to play this much more muscular role on the world stage. And if we don't, then I think we are going to be, as Carney said, on that menu. Mm-hmm.
Ella, one of the big conversations here in Saskatchewan over the last number of months because of Trump are the tariffs and how they're impacting ag and agriculture here. And then there's the retaliatory tariffs with China and everything else. India is a big trade partner, particularly with our ag here. How much of these conversations between leaders, I know on the provincial level, premiers really get in there and try and vouch for our provinces and our products, but are world leaders having those conversations as well, or are those as important as national security and everything else going on?
Yeah, no, they absolutely are. And I think if we look at the meetings of the finance ministers and central bankers that happened in Banff a few weeks ago, if you read that outcome statement, I mean, it was clear that they avoided the T word, the tariff word. And that was deliberate because, of course, there are U.S. negotiators that are finalizing these documents as well. But what we also know is that even though the tariff word was not explicitly mentioned in that document, and those ministerials often set the stage for what's going to follow at the actual G7 when the leaders meet, even though tariffs weren't explicitly called out in that document, tariffs were talked about behind the scenes a lot from what we understand, right? There are discussions happening between, bilateral meetings or trilateral meetings between ministers, between the Sherpa teams, to try to figure out how we can broker a deal. And this was no different yesterday when Carney had his bilateral meeting with Trump. I mean, we came out of that with relatively good news. Of course, Canada wanted a deal struck. Would have been great to have a deal struck yesterday in Kananaskis. That would have been a huge win. But Carney did tweet that something is likely to happen in the next 30 days. And, Trump said, okay, we've got a different perspective on, what this deal is going to look like. And he favors tariffs. But I think, there is a fairly short runway now, 30 days, and we could see a deal. So even though tariffs are not being explicitly called out, discussions around tariffs are absolutely happening in the background.
I want to talk to you about the success rate of these conversations. There's a lot of things that we are promised coming out of these G7 gatherings. What's their ratio of promise to success?
Oh, okay. So, Sam, that's a pretty loaded question, and I'll tell you why. We've been tracking these summits since 1996, the G7 summits, and then the G20 summits since the elevation to the leaders level in 2008. So we actually produce these, very dense 400, 500-page documents every year that take, all the key issues that are focused on at that particular summit, and we do very in-depth analytical assessments on those, right? And all that information is available on our website. It's a lot of detail. Overall, though, we can say that compliance absolutely does vary by country, by issue, over time, right? There are points in our history that we've seen, compliance has been better in some issue areas over others. Typically, macroeconomic policy has figured quite high on the agenda, as well as aid and development assistance, particularly to the highly indebted developing countries. And then we tend to see lower compliance in areas where commitments span a number of years, particularly around climate change, right? Where the leaders could agree in principle that they're going to meet their Paris commitments and they're going to try to hit that 1.5 degree target. But of course, these commitments don't happen between one summit and the next. These are commitments that have a longer lifespan, right? Over a decade sometimes. So those are typically commitments where the leaders don't do as well, just because there are a lot of ebbs and flows. Leadership changes over those years and policy shift. But overall, our results anyway from our independent, and these are independent assessments, indicate that there is a lot of value placed in these meetings, because they do tend to follow up when they make commitments on certain issues that are important internationally and also domestically. Leaders take those commitments home, and there is then a process in place to follow through. And we will get better commitments once the countries themselves start doing these analytical assessments, and that's something we've been pushing for quite a long time.
Amazing.
But they can actually track each other.
Oh, that's great. Okay, we're up on the end of the show. Last word is to you, Brian. What would success look like coming out of this? It could be a low bar, but what does success look like?
So my fear, to be honest, is that when Trump sees all the leaders who stayed, because he probably expect them all to leave because he left, so therefore the party should end, is that you see a bit of revenge tweeting based on his sort of FOMO, a fear of missing out and seeing what's going on without him. So my fear is that doesn't happen, and hopefully he is distracted. But I think what comes out of this is Canada looking I think professional and at the center of things, and having shaped one of the most important events going to be happening this year. And that Trump in that context was, I'm going to say well behaved, but respected the people that were there. And I think that really speaks to Carney's stature and the respect that the other leaders have. And I think it also shows that the world will go on despite that erratic nature, that the rest of the countries are going to continue to move and work more closely together. And I think that's the important piece to sort of balance off some of that erratic nature that we're going to expect to see in the next little while.
Well, we'll see what happens this afternoon and what happens between now and the next one in France. Thank you both so much for your input and your expertise today. I know that you're both very passionate about this, and I appreciate your time today. Ella Kokotsis is the Director of Accountability for the G7 Research Group at the University of Toronto. And Brian McQuinn is an Associate Professor in the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of Regina. And don't forget, he has a new podcast. It is called Rebuilding Canada's Influence.